Hey everyone. Thank you for being here. I think we're still waiting on a few other people who registered, but we have kind of a lot of information to get through today. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in so we make sure we have time to cover everything. I just want to briefly let you know that I am recording this meeting. It will probably be edited and posted on one of the Writing Center platforms at some time in the future. Just so you know, you're being recorded, but it's no problem. When we get to the Q&A, you can jump in and ask questions, or we can use the chat feature, whichever you're more comfortable with. So thank you so much for coming to the Writing Center's webinar on writing effective thesis statements. I'm Katrina Denman. I'm a consultant at the Center for Writing and Rhetoric here at CGU and a PhD candidate in history. And I'm going to be walking you through our webinar. So before we get started, I did post a file of the workshop slides in the chat, so feel free to download that. I've had some times where files in the chat weren't working for people, so if you can't open it, I've also posted my email address, and feel free when we're done, you can just send me an email and I'll send you a link to the slides. I just want to let you know that at the beginning, so you're not trying to write everything down in case there's something you want to come back to or work on later. So typically, if we were together and we maybe had more time, we would arrange this as more of a workshop approach where we might work together. For this, I'm probably just going to go through the few exercises that I have built into the slides, but I would suggest, be thinking about a paper project you're working on, and maybe you can start to develop some ideas for approaching your thesis. Maybe have a piece of paper or an empty Word doc to just kind of start jotting down a few notes as we get to the exercises, and you can always revisit them later and go into more detail. So I think we will go ahead with that and dive in. I just want to let you know, since I'm hosting and going through the slides, I'm probably not going to be monitoring the chat while I'm going through the webinar. So if you have questions, comments, I'm going to be really happy to answer those when we get to a Q&A at the end. I just might not see them before that. So I'm going to go ahead and hopefully my screen will share successfully. Where are my slides? Sorry, I have the wrong one here. There we go. Okay. So hopefully you guys can see this. Let me know if you're not seeing the shared screen. Okay, great. You can see it. So I think we should be good. Okay, so welcome to our webinar on writing effective thesis statements. And I really wanted to cover this topic today since it's really one of, if not the most important writing skill to learn, to really have a strong foundation for developing the most persuasive and clear and clearly argued papers that you can. And this really applies whether you're new to grad school and kind of developing your writing tools, or if you're writing a dissertation. I come back to this for writing my thesis statements for chapters. It's really an ongoing process developing how to do this well. And I think it's something that'll continue even post-grad school into your professional career, your writing papers for publication. It's really a tool that you want to keep developing and have a focus on making as working on as effectively as possible so that your papers have a strong foundation to begin with. So what are we going to cover in this webinar today? So we're going to start out with the basics. What is a thesis statement? And this is, we want to make sure we're on the same page. We're looking at it the same way. We're going to build in kind of a foundation that we are going to then develop out from through building on that with more effective tools. What makes an effective thesis statement? So we're going to go through some elements that you really want to include in your thesis in order to make it as strong as possible. So we'll look at what some of those are, and then we'll see some examples of thesis statements that have done this successfully that you could use as models for your own work. And finally, what should I avoid in my thesis statement? So we're going to have a brief checklist of kind of common pitfalls that it's really easy to fall into when developing a thesis, but things to kind of keep in mind that you want to avoid if you're editing and you're revising, and these are the issues you kind of want to develop past as you continue to work on your thesis. So first of all, what is a thesis statement? So it's essentially the main argument you're making, the main point you want to express through your writing. So it's the overall construction. What is the one thing that you want your reader to take away from your paper? If they only read your thesis, would they still have a good understanding of what your approach is, what your argument is, and why it matters? Your thesis also forecasts the content of your paper. You want your reader to know right from the beginning what's going to be happening in this paper. What should they expect? What do they think that you're going to do throughout the course of your paper? So this is really going to be where you lay out that overarching question that you keep coming back to as you develop in more detail through the actual body of your paper. Your thesis should be fully and specifically addressed in your work. So I've sometimes seen it happen. This is really easy to fall into. You start with a thesis and then you start writing and you realize it's kind of going off track. And maybe that original thesis question has gotten lost a little bit. So you really want to keep your thesis in mind throughout and make sure that you keep coming back to that main point, keep tying it into that overall argument that you're making. And finally, and this is an important point, we're actually going to come back to this a little later, it should come early in your paper. And this is something I've seen a lot where a thesis kind of gets buried at the very end of an introduction. It's several pages in. That's just not the most effective way to present your argument. You really want your reader to know right from the beginning what the main point of this paper is and why they're reading it. I've sometimes had people say they kind of want to wait to reveal it. And I think this is, it's not a mystery novel. We don't need to wait for the twist. You want your reader to know right from the start, what are you doing in this paper? Why should they read this paper? So it should usually probably come in a first paragraph. If you're writing a longer paper and you maybe have an intro with an anecdotal context or something like that, maybe it'll come early in a second paragraph, but it really should almost always be on the first page of your paper. And I always say, think about it when you're doing your readings for class or for research. I know for me, I'm always really happy when an author puts their thesis right at the beginning, so I don't have to go digging for that argument. I know right at the start what it is, so I know if this paper is valuable to me, I know what they're working on. So essentially, if it would help you in what you are reading, then it's something you should plan to do in your writing. So how to think about a thesis. So we've kind of looked at what it is, but sometimes it can feel a little daunting. How do I get there? How do I turn all of this reading into a specific thesis? So really the kind of thought process you're going to be going through is beginning by formulating your research question. So almost all theses they're going to always start with a question. This is the big picture. What do you want to address? What is the question that you had from your research? What is the question in your field that can be further developed? Essentially, what is the purpose of your paper? What are you providing an answer to? And that answer that you provide is going to be your thesis. And the thesis is going to be obviously the short form overarching version of this that you'll develop throughout your paper. But essentially, you're going to start with your research question. Your thesis is going to be, how would you answer that question? What is your argument being made in response to that original question? And then finally, you want to be thinking about this so what question. So we have a research question, you've given an answer, but you still need to provide, why was this important in the first place? What's the larger significance to your field, to a specific area of research, to a real world question, whatever you're working on? You want to make sure that you're giving that larger context. Why did you need to answer this question in the first place? And briefly here, I'm going to mention something I should have said earlier. I'm coming from a humanities background, so some of this will probably be a little more humanities focused, but I think that these general questions, general approaches apply no matter what field you're working in. So some of my examples may feel a little more humanities based, but I think this is really something you can adapt to any field. And these are important questions to be able to address no matter what you're writing about. So how do you come up with a thesis statement? And like I said, this is kind of the most daunting part of the process, knowing where to begin. So if you're kind of sitting there, you know what your paper is, but you're not really sure what that research question is yet. So you're not really sure what question you're answering in your thesis. These are just a few kind of brief questions to be thinking about doing your work that might help that start to come together. So think about the questions that you want answered. As you've been reading your class readings, your research, what are some unanswered points that you'd like to know more about? My sub point there, kind of what do you want to know about your text? So that might be, oops, sorry, I had a glitch there. That might be your primary text. So if you are in the humanities, it might be, a literary text. It might be a manuscript thesis or a history manuscript. If you're coming from another field, maybe this is data, maybe this is a case study, but what are unanswered questions that you have after doing all of that research? What connections have you found between texts? Maybe you have disparate sources. At first glance, they don't seem to go together, but you're noticing common themes. So kind of getting into my next point here. What are some overarching topics that seem to keep coming up? Is there a way you can link two disparate things together in a new way? That might be your starting point for a research question. So just be looking at continuity, at connections, and be thinking about things that haven't been addressed in your readings and what you want to know more about. And finally, what would you want someone else to know about what you've discovered? The main point in you writing a research paper is that it be interesting and that it present new ideas that someone wants to know more about. So think about someone who's not in your class or who is not in grad school at all. What would you want to tell them about the work that you're doing? What do you think would be interesting? And that might be a starting point for coming up with that research question that's going to provide an intriguing base that you want to build out a paper based upon. So we've kind of looked at what a thesis is, kind of starting to formulate a research question that it's going to address. So once you've spent some time and you kind of have the beginnings of your research question, the way you're going to start turning that into a thesis is start by writing a couple of sentences answering that question. This is going to be kind of your first pass. Don't worry about this being a refined final thesis at this point. This is just your starting point, starting to get ideas out. What approach do you think you might want to take in answering that question? And once you have kind of a few starting point sentences, begin revising. So if they're pretty broad, bringing them down to a more specific level, revise for precision, make them more concise. And this is something we're going to look at in a little more detail. It can be much harder to present your ideas in a concise form than in a longer form, but continue to build on those first ideas. So if your first answers to the research question are really broad, start thinking about how you can narrow them down, how you can make them more interesting, how you can make them more complete. And one thing I want to point out here is as you're thinking about these ideas, I suggest thinking in I statements. And I've sometimes had people say that somewhere along the line they learned not to use the first person in academic writing. That's definitely not true. So I would be thinking in this form, I argue that. That's really going to be your starting place for your thesis. And you want to be thinking in terms of how would I answer that question? I argue that what? And really keep it in that format. And that's going to help you stay on track, make sure you're making an argument, not just a declarative statement, and make it clear and concise. And following from that, so I really want to emphasize these three key statements. Essentially, if you only take one thing away from this webinar today, you only remember one thing, it's going to be these three key terms, which are argument, evidence, significance. And I've had a professor who wanted the paper to be set up using this exact kind of verbiage, this exact structure. I recommend doing this. You can include this in your final paper. This is a good structure to follow to make sure you're addressing all of the main points. And even if your final version ends up looking a little different, you really should be able to fill in the blanks of these questions, at least verbally, as you're thinking about it. And if you can't, if you're kind of struggling on these, it probably means you need to do a little more thinking, a little more developing of your thesis until you're really comfortable answering these questions. So your first statement is, in this paper, I argue that. And this is really the foundation of your thesis statement. The way that you finish that sentence is going to form the foundation, probably be your key thesis statement. And it's good to phrase it this way. I've seen a lot of times people will say, this paper argues. I've even seen people kind of say this author argues about themselves, which is kind of awkward, but I suggest, just be direct. I argue that. We know you're the one who's making this argument. And I know sometimes, especially if you're not sure if you're on the right track, and I've done this, we kind of want to separate ourselves from the argument a little bit, but really just dive in, just be clear this is your argument. And this is going to be a really important sentence to be able to complete to ensure that you have a successful base for your thesis. So number 2, I will do so using what as evidence. And of course, you're not going to list everything you use as evidence here, but what are your main sources? What is your main type of source? Whatever is really the foundation for the evidence you're going to use to prove that argument that you're making in the paper, you want to lay it out clearly. And then finally, once you've done that, the purpose of my research is, and this is that significance question, what's the larger point? So why do I need to read this paper? What's it contributing to your field, to a broader research question, to a real world situation, wherever you're coming from? But you really want to show the reader not just why this argument is significant to this one paper, but what's kind of a larger purpose that you're showing. So really, argument, evidence, significance, just kind of keep that as a mantra. And in a little while, we're going to come back and look at some real world examples of this, ways to actually structure this in a paper, but just kind of keep those 3 things in mind, keep coming back to that as you're structuring your thesis. And that's going to give you a really solid foundation. Okay, so we're not going to actually, we don't have time today to actually pause and work through these exercises. If you're watching this as a recording, I've built in suggested pause time. So I would suggest pause the recording, work on the exercise, and then resume. But essentially, this is that first question we just looked at. So thinking about a paper that you're working on or planning to work on, can you complete this sentence? In this paper, I argue that. And a lot of times when I ask people this question, I've done this with myself thinking about my own work, there's a 5-minute answer giving all different aspects of what your paper, everything it's looking at, what it includes, but I still don't know what the actual argument is. And it's much more difficult to state that clearly and concisely than to go on and on about it for several pages, which is really easy to have that happen. But this is a good exercise to start to hone that down. So usually I'd ask you guys to kind of work on this with a partner, but you can work on this on your own. So kind of set a timer for 1 minute and verbally answer this question. In this paper, I argue that. And in that 1 minute, kind of how far do you get? Do you go off topic? Can you start to narrow down to something more specific? Once you've worked on that, move on to 30 seconds, begin to make it more concise. Can you get through it in a 30-second period? And then finally, ultimately in 1 sentence. So cutting out all the chaff, all the extra information, getting it just down to that essential answer to your research question. And write this down where you are at this point. And that's going to be your building block for your thesis. So it might not be your final thesis at this point, but it's what you're going to take as the basis and then begin building out from. So I would suggest at some point, if you have time, kind of work on this through one of your own projects. It might be interesting to see what it's actually like for you and what it tells you about your own work. So we're actually going to move straight on to another exercise, which is going to be a few examples of what this kind of first draft sentence might look like. And then, is it a good starting place for a thesis? Yes or no? What still needs to be done? So if you're working on this at home, maybe pause for a few seconds, think about what you think is good or bad about these potential theses, and then we're just going to, in the webinar, we're just going to kind of quickly go through them, but you can kind of pause and think about those, what you would add, subtract, kind of how you would start to refine it. So example number 1. In this paper, I argue that, so we've got our proper construction there. World War I was a global conflict with diverse and complex origins. So, is this a good starting point? If this was your first sentence, is this something to work from? My answer is no. This really isn't a thesis statement. These facts are so general and vague as to be kind of pointless. This is the kind of sentence I would probably just cross out of a paper altogether. There's no real argument here. There's nothing interesting about this. Somebody couldn't really present an alternative viewpoint or question your interpretation. It's really just such a statement of fact that there's nowhere to go with it. So if your first kind of draft of a thesis is this broad, you probably need to spend some time working it down to a more specific level. So number 2, in this paper, I argue that World War I was a global conflict whose origins were rooted in the rise of nationalism, growing imperialism, increased militarism, and changing economic interests. So we've definitely got more detail happening here, but it's still not really a great thesis. It's not very compelling. It's still pretty general. There's not really adding anything new. It's also so broad. If you started to think about your next sentence where you talk about the evidence you use, it would be hard to know where you'd even start with that on a question this big. So if you're at a level that's this big, you really need to still keep narrowing it down, keep focusing it down. So finally, number 3. In this paper, I argue that World War I was a global conflict whose origins were shaped by a lack of efficient systems of communication, combined with a decrease in effective diplomatic tactics. So we're continuing to hone down. So I would say for this one, yeah, this is a defendable thesis statement. It's a new interpretation. It's not so broad as to be undefensible or inarguable. It can be supported by specific evidence. You can kind of see where you'd go with that. And it makes a clear argument. It's still a bit broad, so this would probably be something you would want to continue to refine. Obviously, this would be more of a big picture question. If you're writing a research paper, you want to bring it down to a much smaller level. But if this is kind of where you were at with that first draft thesis, you'd at least be on the right track to developing this into something solid. So now that we've kind of gone through what the thesis is, a couple of examples, we're going to go through how to develop, that starting point sentence into a strong thesis statement. What are some of the elements you want to be sure to include? So 1, clear and concise. You really want it to be to the point, not a lot of extra detail, not a lot of extra information. Like we said, you should be able to present this in one sentence. It's specific. You don't want to be talking about really big picture questions that you can't address. That might go more into a significant question, but it's probably not going to be the thesis. You really want to hone in on a specific point that you can really address effectively throughout your paper. Typically, you want it to be arguable, not a statement of fact. So kind of as we looked at with those examples right before this, if they're just accepted generalities, accepted statements, there's really nowhere to go with that thesis. You want to present something that somebody else could potentially take an opposing viewpoint, maybe doubt your interpretation, and then your job is to prove your thesis through your evidence. And finally, just make it interesting. You want your reader to be intrigued. Think about if you're reading work and if the thesis is interesting, it's specific, there's something intriguing about it, you're more likely to want to read the paper. So this is kind of a final step as you've worked through all these other parts of the process, but you want to just hook your reader, make them want to read your paper. Why should they read your paper? Make it something interesting. So to go into just a little bit more detail on a couple of these points. So clear and concise, and this is really important. You want to be able to state your thesis in one sentence. So kind of we looked at, if we go back to, argument, evidence, significance, possibly that'll end up being 3 sentences. A lot of times you can work those all into one sentence, but you really want your thesis to be no more than, 1 to 3 sentences. If it's going on for half a page, it's probably just too much information. It's not specific enough. The rest of your introduction that comes after can add that detail about the hows, the whats, the whys. You don't have to feel like you have to include all of your information just in the thesis, but the thesis itself should be clear, to the point, and relatively brief. It should present a total picture of your main argument. So again, this isn't going to be every aspect that you cover in your paper, but it should be kind of your touchstone main point that you keep coming back to throughout the rest of your paper. So you might use sub-arguments to develop that thesis, but just keep your thesis in mind, and it should present all of the real main points that you want to express, all of those things that you want to be sure the reader takes away at that big picture level, that big argument level. Avoid padding with throwaway words. This can mean a lot of different things. Typically, it goes back to just concision, take out extra words, anything that's really broad. And we're going to come back to this on our kind of don'ts checklist, but a lot of things, if you're hedging on something, I hope to argue that, this paper attempts to show, just cut those out, make it clear, I argue that, this paper shows that. And sometimes I see constructions like this paper argues something about this topic, which is, and it just kind of gets into this wordy construction. So just try to make it that I argue that, the main point, done. And as I mentioned, avoid hedging. And this can be something we do, especially if you're not confident in your arguments, you're not sure if you're on the right track. There's this, I hope to argue, I try to show, but really just be confident. State that, I argue that statement, just hold on to that and just be clear and to the point in what you're arguing. Specific and arguable. Avoid broad statements. You don't want to start your thesis with something like, from its inception as a discipline, cultural studies has attempted to answer the question of that. I mean, that's very big, very broad. You want to bring it down to something more specific that you're actually addressing in the context of this paper. Something you can actually answer and address in the context of a relatively short paper. This is a quote that I borrowed from the Minnesota Library's publishing project that I like. A thesis doesn't summarize an issue, it dissects it. So this is really where you avoid your kind of descriptive statements. You don't want to just say, here's what the issue is. You want to really dive into your analysis. What are the important points? What are the individual facets we need to take a closer look at? How can we deconstruct this and then put it back together using my argument in a way that I think adds something to this question? Can somebody disagree with me? So this is kind of what we mentioned before. Is this arguable? And again, this is a way to avoid general statements of fact and move more into that realm of argument. You want somebody to be able to at least potentially take another side, say, I had a different interpretation, and then it's your job to convince them of your side. I mean, that's basically what we're doing in academics in general, right? Convincing people we're right. Am I presenting an original idea? So this is one, I know if you're working on a seminar paper, a class paper, there's that sense of like, well, how do I know? I haven't done all the reading on this topic. I'm not going to present this amazing new approach in this one class paper. But what I mean by that is essentially don't just rehash something you've already read in the readings. Don't take a thesis from another paper and just kind of restate it. Try to add something of your own interpretation. Maybe it's just a new approach, maybe it's new evidence, a slightly different nuance to it. You want something that separates you out from what you're reading. Even if you don't know all the literature, it's not about coming up with an amazing new topic. You just want to add something that's a little different than what you've read specifically. And what am I contributing to the scholarly conversation? Again, this is much more important if you're writing a thesis or a dissertation than if you're just writing a course paper. But even in that case, what are you adding? Even just to the readings you've done in that class, are you contributing something new, a new approach, a new outlook? Essentially, why is somebody reading your paper instead of all the papers that already exist? What new approach are you bringing to this topic? Okay, so we have now gone through what is a thesis statement, how to start kind of brainstorming research questions. We've looked at starting your foundation for your thesis and then expanding it outward, going back to our argument, evidence, significance, structure. So now I'm going to show you a few examples of what that looks like in practice. Since we've been looking at this kind of in the abstract, it's kind of harder to picture how this should actually be presented. So I want to pull out a few examples of that argument, evidence, significance, structure to show you how you might begin to put this in practice. And these are actually examples pulled from early modern scholarship from peer-reviewed journals. I originally taught this webinar as part of a class that was on early modern history, so that's why I have these examples. I'm not an early modernist, so I'm not necessarily advocating for how good these papers are. They just have good examples of how to construct your thesis statement. So, and another thing I want to point out, so this first one we're going to look at follows our argument, evidence, significance structure, the way that I laid it out earlier. But you might be, if you've come to the Writing Center, you might be familiar with the axis method of paragraph development. And you'll know that although that's an acronym for us to remember the elements, they don't always go in the same order in practice. And it's the same with your argument, evidence, significance. They might not always come in that order. I think it's a good idea as you're kind of formulating your thesis, thinking about it, to be thinking about it in that sequence, because it helps you keep that kind of logical flow. But sometimes in your final presentation, in your final paper, it's going to follow a slightly different structure. And that's okay. You just want to make sure these elements are present in some way. So let's take a look at this first example, which follows our structure, and I think is a really good one. If I was going to kind of suggest one of these thesis statements to come back to and maybe use as a model in your own work, I would probably do this one. I think it really covers all the bases in a really clear and effective way. So in this essay, I argue that, so there you go with our construction, a particular order of imagery, which I will term invisible images, emerged in answer to this pressing question. So obviously I've taken this out of context, but previously would have been where they stated that research question. So kind of where we started at the beginning, and they're now obviously giving their answer, their interpretation of that. To represent the barely visible Reformed Church as the vehicle of the invisible true Church of Christ. So there we've got a really clear argument. I can know from reading that exactly what this author is going to argue in the course of this paper. No question marks, no interpretation. It's just kind of all laid out for us right there. So juxtaposing images of invisibility from Fox's Acts and Monuments and Spencer's The Fairy Queen. So there again, we have a clear presentation of evidence. We have the exact two sources that this author is going to use, and we know exactly what she's going to do to begin to develop and to answer her thesis question here. And then the significance. So why is she looking at this argument? Why is she using this? Well, it reveals not only new aspects of these historical and poetic projects, so kind of a very big picture approach, but also the subtlety and depth of the English Reformation's continuous struggle to define both itself and its modes of apprehending divine truth. So obviously you're here, the significance is a bit more specific to a particular field, a particular question, but that's okay. It doesn't always have to be a big, broad question about why the world at large needs to know about this. But this kind of construction just really clearly shows what the argument is, what the evidence is, and then why she's using this, what bigger picture. So not just about this question of invisible images, but how does that contribute to this larger conversation, this larger topic that's happening in this field? So I would say, really come back to something like this, and this is how you want to be thinking about presenting your thesis. So let's go ahead and look at a couple that follow a slightly different construction. So this one kind of gives a broad significance first, then goes into the argument, then goes into the evidence. And one thing I'd like to point out here is that when I was looking for these examples, it actually took me a really long time to find them. Even in published academic work in scholarly journals, there were so many papers where I could not identify the thesis. And that's really a problem. And that's something you want to avoid in your own work. You really want the reader, it shouldn't take them more than a couple of minutes, a couple of pages to find your thesis and really know what it is. And so that's why I say this is a process to develop throughout your academic career. And there's a lot of papers out there that don't do this particularly well. But you want to make sure you're not one of them, that you really keep developing this skill. So this one begins, in this essay, we would like to make a foray into, and honestly, that's the kind of construction I'd probably say to avoid, things like we would like to, feels like extraneous language that doesn't need to be there. Kind of just get to the point is what I would say. But into gendered legal history of early modern England. So this is their significance. This is the larger context that they're looking at this question in. And then I've identified this as argument through the problem of slander as experienced by contemporary women. But I'm not sure that this is really a clear argument. It's more kind of what the topic is. So I'm not sure that this really answers that I will argue that question. But this is something you could kind of use as a beginning point to be at least thinking about what your main point is, what your main topic is. And then as represented and commented upon in Shakespeare's play, The Winter's Tale. So that's a very good, clear presentation of the evidence. So this one I would say, isn't ideal in all its aspects, but it just shows that sometimes you can flip around the order a little bit and it can still work. And the good thing about this one is it's very short and to the point. So although it's not maybe getting through the whole argument, it's expressing, you read this and you know exactly what this paper is about. So this might be something of a lead in to your thesis. Maybe your next sentence would be, in this paper, I argue that, but this is a good kind of concise introduction to that. So here's one that has a slightly different order again. Evidence, I would say this one is kind of more showing a context than a significance, but then finally the argument. So by treating Fox's stories, so there we've got the evidence, and obviously there's more detail about this in the rest of the introduction, but kind of picking out this thesis, you just need to have what it is. You don't have to go into every possible detail at this point. So within the perspective of current scholarship on women's history and spirituality. So this isn't necessarily saying what this contributes to that, but it's showing that larger academic context, that larger academic conversation that's happening. So we know what general areas this paper is adding to. Kind of, we have right from the start what its kind of genre is and where it's going. And then the argument. So this study will examine, so that's another good setup for a thesis, how Fox's female confessors of the faith undergo a dual process of spiritual growth and moral liberation from the restraints of Tudor society and the Roman Church. So I would probably say, this study, I would probably rephrase this slightly to fit that this study will argue question, or this paper will argue rather than will examine. Again, examine, we can start to get a little bit into that kind of descriptive, maybe not showing exactly what your takeaway is. It might tell us what the paper is about, but I think the argument is built into their sentence here. So I would always just suggest, use that, I argue that, just so there's no ambiguity. It's clear, the setup is totally clear. So this is a slightly longer one, but again, this one kind of takes a similar construction. So significance, evidence, argument. So this one begins with significance. So this essay explores the ways in which two interrelated concepts, Christ-like self-sacrifice and the promise of salvation, contributed to the public image of Queen Elizabeth, and how these concepts function to enhance her claims to power. So it's getting down to a fairly particular level. These two concepts are pretty specific, but it's also showing the larger issue that they're addressing in this scholarship, this kind of idea of the claim to power. So this is one kind of building block for that larger argument. So then getting into the evidence, in doing so, I focus particular attention on three symbols, which are traditionally there's a typo there, associated with Christ, but which are employed in Elizabeth's iconography: the pelican, the phoenix, and the orb. So this is an example where the evidence is not necessarily a text, it's more these three symbols that they're going to dive into. But I think that's okay because they're showing the specific elements they're going to look at in order to prove and support this thesis. So getting into the thesis now, so I argue that, so there's our construction. When used in portraits and other representations of the Queen, these symbols merit closer consideration as visual reference to Christ's redemptive suffering and the hope of salvation it offered. So this is really another good one because it's showing the big concepts, the big picture, then the specific iconography they're going to dissect, and then showing really clearly how that iconography directly relates back to the significance. So this is one way that it can be successful to put your significance first, as long as you clearly bring out these other elements and make sure that they all tie together. But I would say this is another example that does this very successfully. So this is another element to come back to. And these are a bit long. I would say, your thesis probably should be able to be stated. This is almost going on a paragraph here. You probably want it to be a little shorter, even though this is only 3 sentences. I would say, keep cutting it down, but as long as it's clear how it all fits together, I don't feel like this example has a lot of extra words, extra information. So if you can really get a lot of information out in that clear and concise way, then I say go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that we've seen a couple of good examples of what you kind of want to strive for in making your thesis statement, we're going to take a quick look at a few common issues with thesis statements. And these are ones that come up all the time. We're all guilty of this. I know I've done this many times. And I think especially when we're at that point of not being as clear and confident in the argument we're making, we're still not really sure exactly what it is. Maybe we're stuck on that research question answer construction, and we're not really sure yet what that answer should look like. So a lot of times there's a tendency to make too sweeping, too grand a statement. And this is kind of what I talked about before. You want to make sure it's specific, but you also want to make sure you don't kind of alienate your reader with a statement like this, which is The Great Gatsby is inarguably the best written novel of the last 100 years. Well, if you start with a statement like that, there's going to be a lot of readers that immediately disagree with that, and then you've kind of lost them. And you're not phrasing it as an argument you're going to make. You're making a very large generalization that's going to be pretty much impossible to prove. And so is really kind of irrelevant to your argument and kind of leaves your reader maybe not as invested in what you're saying. So this is just so broad as to be sort of useless. So unless you're coming down to a specific point, kind of keep refining, keep bringing it down to something that you can argue, you can address, you can actually attempt to prove. We kind of talked before about hedging. It's too tentative. And this is something, I know I have done this, we all do this. We kind of want to show that we're not sure about what we're doing. And we use language like, I'll try to show, I hope to argue. But that really just tells your reader that you're not confident, you're not clear. And especially if you're writing this for a class, your professor is reading this, present it as a confident statement. You don't want to show them that you're not really sure what you're talking about. So in this example, in his novel, The Long Walk, it seems as if Stephen King is attempting to make a statement about the evils of laissez-faire capitalism. And in my opinion, the characters and settings reflected this well. Well, this kind of language, it seems as if that's very broad. It's really not saying that you really understood or interpreted this issue. That's really not something you want to put in your academic writing. You really want to be clear. You want to put Stephen King is attempting to make a statement. Make it as a statement, prove why you think it's right. And then this other part, in my opinion, the characters and settings reflected this well. Again, we know this is your opinion. We know you're the one writing the paper, but really state it as though you believe this to be true, and then use the rest of your paper proving why others should take the same viewpoint. And then another one is, and we kind of looked at this earlier, it's just too vague. And I think we saw this in the kind of World War I thesis examples I showed, where they were so big, so vague that there's really nowhere to go with it. It's not interesting. How could you begin to kind of answer that evidence question? There's really just nothing to intrigue your reader into this issue. So this one, in this essay, I will try to prove, so again, kind of hedging words there, that drugs such as Prozac and Paxil are unnecessary and probably dangerous. Again, these are just very vague statements. There's really nothing about this that intrigues your reader, makes them want to know more. It's going to be very difficult for you to follow a really clear and concise a form of argumentation when you're starting with something so broad. So for your own sake, just keep narrowing it down, keep bringing it to something more specific, as we saw in those early modern examples, where they're really looking at very particular, very focused questions. And again, I really want to leave you with this one because this is one I've seen a lot and it's just really important. It comes too late in the paper. And this might seem like a small issue. You know, what does it matter if my thesis isn't until page 3 or it comes at the end of my introduction? But there's a few reasons why this is really important. One, it loses significance. When I start reading a paper and there's a lot of background information and it's building up, I don't know what the point is. So everything I'm reading is kind of lost to me because I don't know where it's going. Whereas if I know right at the beginning, okay, this is the argument, well, now I know why you're giving me this information. And so I'm much more likely to remember it, to appreciate it, than if I'm reading thinking, I have no idea where this is going. And again, think about readings you've done for class or for research. I know for me, it's much easier for me to follow the information in the article as a whole if I know right from the start what the point is, where it's going. And kind of connected to that, the so what question. You're kind of leave your reader reading all this background information and all you're thinking is, so what? Why are you telling me this? Why do I need to know this? And another problem that can come from that is a reader begins to apply their own interpretations or conclusions to the evidence you're showing them or the information you're giving them. And the problem is if their idea is not the same as your thesis, then when they finally get to your thesis, they might be thinking, well, that's totally wrong because that's not where I thought this was going. And so you're already making a harder job for your task to have to rein them back in and convince them of something. So to that final point, you want to avoid preconceived ideas. You want to guide your reader through your paper. You don't want them to be coming to their own conclusions, which might not be the same as yours. And then you're just going to lose your audience. But if you tell them right from the start, this is my argument, then they're looking at all of your context, your information, your evidence in that proper context so that they know what the point is, what larger point you're building to by presenting this information. And you're in control of how that they're looking at that rather than letting them get too far into their own ideas about it. So again, if you're working through this through the recording, maybe just go ahead and pause for a few minutes. So go back to that sentence we worked on way back in exercise 1 and start to dissect your own work. Does it fall into one of these don't categories? Is it vague? Is it hedging? Kind of going back to the strong thesis statements, to some of the elements we want to include. How can you make it stronger? And just make some notes. What do you need to add? What's missing? What do you think is really important to include to make this a strong and effective thesis statement, kind of based on some of these elements we looked at, some of the examples we looked at? What do you still need to do to get your work to that level? And again, come back to the argument, evidence, significance. Are you struggling to answer one of those, to complete one of those statements? That's probably the area you need to go back, keep thinking about, keep building on, keep adding to. And finally, I just want to leave you with keep evolving. The draft of your thesis, it's just a starting point. It's just a place to get your ideas together, to know what the rest of your paper should flow from. But you're almost always going to end up revising it once you begin writing, if only because you don't know where your paper is going until you do the research and do the writing. Just for myself, my dissertation thesis is essentially the opposite of what I started with. So don't be afraid to let it evolve, let it change. That's always going to happen. And as part of that, don't get too attached to one concept. I've seen people who sometimes come up with what they think is just a really great framing device, really great thesis. It doesn't end up working out, but they really force their evidence, force their paper to fit this model, and it just doesn't work. So no matter how good your thesis is, if it's not actually working with your paper, let it go, start again, evolve your thesis. Don't think that where you start out with is what you have to hold on to. It's just a place to structure from. But then at the end, you're probably going to come back and go through all these steps to rewrite your thesis again. But it's going to be much easier because you're already going to have your paper. So you're going to know exactly where you're going and exactly what you want to do in the thesis. So kind of next steps for this, I would suggest, as you're doing your readings, as you're doing your research, just start paying attention to how the author uses a thesis. Maybe start highlighting ones that you think are good, ones you think are bad. I would suggest, even keeping a Word document going where you cut and paste ones that you think are really effective, kind of like I showed here with some of the early modern examples. If you come across one that you just think really addresses all the elements really well, hold on to it. Use that same structure in your own writing. That can be really helpful to develop those kind of writing references. More info, these are a couple of the places where I took a few of the quotes we looked at. They also have links to more thesis writing exercises, some more information. So if this is something you want to keep working on, those are some great places to start. And finally, let's keep talking. If you don't have an account with the Center for Writing and Rhetoric, please come to our website and sign up. We can talk about developing your thesis statements. We can talk about any part of your writing process. And this can be brainstorming. If you don't know how to turn that research question into a thesis, this can be talking about any part of your writing process. Maybe you have a final thesis and you just want some other eyes on it. You can also join our Canvas page. We have a lot of really great writing modules up there on all different aspects of the writing process. We've got videos, handouts, things to work through. So if you haven't already, I suggest that you enroll in the Canvas page. And any questions you have, always feel free to chat with us at the Writing Center. Just send us an email if there's anything about making an appointment, or joining the Canvas page. Anything else you have questions about, feel free to join us. So, okay, great. I'm going to go ahead. I think we are not quite at time. So, yeah, let me check on the chat, anything that I have missed here while I was going through the slides. Yeah, let me re-add my email address here. And like I said, feel free to drop me an email and I can send you the link to the slides. At some point, these should be up on Run of the Writing Center's platform. I'm not sure that they are right now. Probably a version of this video will be up as well. And let me also, in the chat, I'm also putting those two links. So the link to the Writing Center and the link to the Canvas page. So if you'd like to enroll in those. I briefly want to mention we are also hiring at the Writing Center. So if you or anybody knows someone who would like to be a writing consultant, work with students, do these kind of workshops, we'd love to have you apply. The link to that is on the Writing Center website, and there's an ad on the Canvas page. Yeah, so we have 5 minutes. I think we only have a couple of people left, but do either of you have any questions, anything you want to bring up? Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Oh, Yibing, did you have a question? Okay. Yeah, it was great seeing you guys. I'm really glad this was helpful. And as always, any questions, feel free to drop me an email. And yeah, I look forward to working with you guys at the Writing Center. And I hope this helps you as you develop your work. So thanks so much for being here. And have a great rest of your day.